make sure.
Yeah, folks online, if you could give us a thumbs up if you can hear us.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. I'm Max Cook. I'm a graduate student with Dr. Jennifer Balch here in the Earth Lab and the Department of Geography at CU Boulder. I'm giving a talk today that is sort of the first piece of my PhD research, and it's really focused on mapping quaking aspen in the Southern Rocky Mountain Ecoregion. I have our co-authors listed here as well. Most of you know Jennifer. Sarah Hart is a professor at CSU, and she actually is a CU alum as well in geography with Tom Veblen. And so we partner with Colorado State University on this project. And Teresa Chapman is a colleague at the Nature Conservancy. So we can see this list of partners down here, both in terms of funding support and partnership in the project. Specifically pointing out here the Joint Fire Science Program. So this funding is through the Joint Fire Science Program and the Bureau of Land Management. So why are we interested in quaking aspen? There's arguably a lot of reasons to be interested in quaking aspen. It's the most widely distributed tree species in North America. And in the Southern Rocky Mountain ecoregion, it acts as the dominant deciduous tree species, providing or making up nearly 20% of Colorado's forest lands, according to estimates by the Colorado State Forest Service, which is about 5 million hectares estimated. And so we'll probably be testing that theory with this project. Aspen forests provide numerous ecosystem service benefits. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had animations here. So here's the range map. This is an older range map of quaking aspen distribution in North America. So as you can see, it's really widespread in boreal Canada and Alaska. But then we also have a whole lot of it here in Colorado in the Southern Rocky Mountain ecoregion, with a lot also in the Colorado Plateau and the Northern Rockies. So they also provide numerous ecosystem service benefits, ranging from wildlife habitat, species diversity from both the wildlife, flora and fauna perspective, as well as hydrologic functioning and recreational and economic value, right? So each fall when the aspen leaves turn, we have a lot of people come and visit the mountains of Colorado, for example, to see these fall colors. And some of the most quintessential pictures of Colorado are pictures of large aspen stands. Open canopy in aspen forests provide a lot of sunlight and nutrients for understory plants to grow. And so these forests are typically much more diverse in the understory in terms of grasses and forbs that persist in these forest types. Wetter sites in particular offer a lot of biodiversity, biodiversity havens, but even in dry sites, we tend to see higher biodiversity than in conifer neighboring conifer stands. This species is really important for forest resilience as well. The species responds well to changes in root or soil temperature and grows by suckering as the primary form of reproduction, although seed reproduction is becoming more commonly observed. And thus, these forests are often the first to colonize after disturbances. So if fire comes through, generally if there was aspen there before, they're the first to come back after because they respond well to these disturbances. Wildfire is one example, but wind throw, forest clearing, avalanche also provide critical forest resilience. Because of this ability to respond to canopy opening events, aspen and wildfire have really thrived together. So aspen loves wildfire, and we often think of aspen and wildfire as being linked. Some people have coined the term asbestos forests. I'm not sure I'd really like that term, but it's used to describe this relationship between aspen and fire, both from the resilience in terms of its regrowth after fire, but also in terms of its ability to moderate fire behavior. I mean, this is one of the primary questions that we're interested in asking with this project is, how might aspen change fire behavior across the landscape? And if it does, when does it and where does it? And so many of us know that wildfire impacts to communities across the globe, and particularly in the Western US, are growing more severe due to multiple factors: a warming climate, more conducive fire weather, more frequent human ignitions, and more people living in flammable landscapes, past land management practices, including fire suppression in the Western US, where forests are meant to thrive with fire. And so with the number of homes in the WUI and the number of people being impacted by wildfire in the West, we really need to come up with innovative solutions to manage community risk of wildfire. And one of these solutions that has been proposed is the expansion of deciduous forest types, particularly in high elevation forests like lodgepole pine and subalpine fir. Quaking aspen is a natural choice for this type of management activity in the Southern Rockies and in the West in general. And so really what this project is trying to do is build a body of knowledge around that concept. And the first step of that is to develop better maps of quaking aspen cover. So why do we need better maps? There's a few reasons. Here is a table showing accuracies of two of the primary land cover types, or land cover products, excuse me, landfire and NLCD. This table is showing landfire in the Southwest region, which includes the Southern Rocky Mountains. And what we see is we're getting pretty low accuracies in these data sets for the aspen class. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Aspen can be difficult to map on such large scales and along with other species because they have similar spectral characteristics to, say, wetland herbaceous or willows. NLCD, another major land cover product, also has pretty low accuracy. Now, one thing to note here is that NLCD does not specifically call out aspen forests in their product. So it's deciduous forests or mixed forests. So that includes aspen, but it also includes other forest types. And so to understand and to start building a body of knowledge around how aspen may influence wildfire behavior, we really need to have more accurate maps of aspen cover. These existing maps are also based on 30-meter Landsat data. So this is pretty typical of most land cover products. And with the advent or introduction of new satellite sensors, there's an opportunity to map the species at a higher resolution, spatial resolution. One of the important reasons why we need to have this higher resolution is that for managing the species, small areas of aspen cover are important for management because of this adaptation strategy that aspen uses and how it grows through suckering. Being able to identify small stands of aspen and really to delineate where stands currently exist is really important for managing that species when we're talking about expansion of these smaller stands. So I'll jump right in here to the image data that we're using and one of the reasons why we're able to get this higher resolution map. The first satellite and sensor that we're using here is the Sentinel-2 Multispectral Instrument. So the Sentinel-2 MSI is a European Space Agency, wide swath, moderate resolution, multispectral imaging mission. It has these twin missions, S2A and S2B. So it has two satellites that operate in orbit and in tandem. This allows Sentinel to be collecting data at a temporal resolution of 5 days, which means every piece of the Earth gets an image every 5 days from the Sentinel-2 satellite mission. It provides visible and near infrared wavelengths at a 10-meter spatial resolution. And remember, we're comparing this to Landsat-based products at a 30-meter resolution. So that's 9 Sentinel pixels within 1 Landsat pixel. It also captures these really important and narrow red edge spectral signatures in 4 bands at 20 meters. And these red edge signatures are small slices of the near infrared spectrum that are really sensitive to vegetation and particularly to chlorophyll and canopy chlorophyll content. Typically what we see and what I've done in this project is these 20-meter bands are resampled to 10-meter resolution. So effectively the Sentinel-2 Multispectral Instrument is a 10-meter resolution product. Another piece of the Sentinel mission is the Sentinel-1 C-band Synthetic Aperture Radar. So whereas the multispectral instrument is an imaging mission for multispectral data, The Sentinel-1 SAR is an active remote sensing technology. So it actually sends pulses of electromagnetic radiation to the ground and receives backscatter from the ground as it flies over. So this is, again, an ESA mission comprising 2 polar orbiting satellites. One of the interesting things about SAR and what makes it really useful in fuels, vegetation, and fire mapping is that it operates day and night and can capture images in any weather, right? So the radar capability allows it to penetrate clouds and all but the most severe weather. Again, this is a 10-meter spatial resolution and a 5-day temporal resolution. And that spatial resolution for the C-band SAR is, it fluctuates depending on what data product you're using. So there's a couple different options. So taking this image data, we want to create these seasonal composites and seasonal spectral indices. So this is our first step in building out a data set to be able to map Aspen across the Southern Rockies. So here's a workflow diagram showing the process to create these image composites. So starting with the Sentinel-2 MSI level 2A surface reflectance product. So this is satellite imagery that has been corrected for atmospheric effects. So there's a couple different levels of the products. We take across our study region, we filter to identify granules or scenes that are less than 60% cloud cover. So this just allows us to remove images that are extremely cloudy and difficult to use in the process. We then perform a cloud masking algorithm. And so what this does, and you can see in this image on the left, is we have a cloudy image, and then the Sentinel product comes with this cloud probability layer. So each pixel has a probability of how likely it is to be a cloud. So using that cloud probability, we can mask out those pixels or remove them from the image. We do this iteratively for all of the images across our time series. One thing that's not clear here is that this is showing we're working with imagery in 2019, so the year of 2019. So for all the images that overlap the Southern Rocky Mountain Ecoregion, which is thousands of images over 2019, we mask out clouds in each of those images. We then partition that data into seasonal time steps. And so these seasonal time steps are summer, which is here we're considering June 15th to September 15th, autumn, September 15th to November 15th, and winter, November 15th to April 30th. So these are critical time periods in the phenology of aspen trees, right? So in the summer, they have their leaves at the most full and wet with the biggest sort of leaf area index in their canopy. In autumn, as we all know, they turn yellow and orange. This makes it really easy to pick them out from a satellite image. And then in the winter as well, they have a unique signature when their leaves are on the ground. So we then take these seasonal composites and all of the cloud masked images in a stack, and we take the median value of those pixels. So essentially what that does is create a median composite for each of these seasons. We then calculate spectral indices, which I'll talk about on the next slide, and we resample to that common resolution of 10 meters. Then we stack these seasonal composites, which results in 67 bands of data. So 67 bands over the 3 composite images. And here on the bottom left, you can see the Southern Rocky Mountain cloud-free image mosaics. And these are in Google Earth Engine, so something I also didn't mention at the outset. And so these assets are actually available now to use if anyone here is interested, these seasonal image composites that are cloud-free. So our spectral indices, we wanted to test a few different spectral indices that have been shown to be really efficient at identifying or differentiating between different species of forest cover. So I have the list here on the left of these spectral indices that we tested. And on the right, an example of these indices for one region outside of Crested Butte, Colorado. And so we'll use that image a couple times throughout the presentation. But as you can see, some of these chlorophyll indices are really sensitive to vegetation, right? So this is a large aspen stand right here with smaller stands all around. And we can see that these show up in many of these indexes. I've provided references here. I won't go into the calculation of each of these indices in this presentation, but if anyone's interested, this is only a subset of the ones that we tested. We actually have equations for a lot of these chlorophyll indices that leverage, again, those red edge bands, the narrow near infrared bands with Sentinel-2. So moving on to our C-band SAR, similar workflow diagram here. And again, for those who are familiar with SAR, this graphic kind of illustrates what is happening when SAR is flying over the land. So it's sending pulses of radiation down to the earth. And as that radiation hits the ground, the surface roughness determines how much is scattered back to the sensor, right? So a more rough surface will scatter more wavelengths back to the sensor, which typically means you have a higher return on bumpy surfaces, right? And on the bottom here, this is showing the various bands available in radar. And each of these bands has specific sort of qualities in how it actually can image the earth, right? And so we're there in the C band, and you can see that in the X band, which is this far left over here, covered by the icon there, there's not much penetration into the tree canopy. So it bounces off the surface of the tree canopy and receives the signal from there. C band, you get a little bit more penetration into the tree canopy, which is helpful for us as well. And then you go into L band and P band, which actually can get a lot more penetration into the tree canopy. But these L band and P bands are often difficult to acquire or to work with. And Sentinel-1, again, available on a 5-day return interval at a 10-meter resolution. So a couple different things that we have to do here with the SAR data. Like I said, there's a lot of different options for what you can use Sentinel-1. And so there's an orbit pass, an instrument mode, and polarizations, right? I won't get into the details on this, but SAR is really interesting. If you're interested in learning more about it, feel free to reach out. So we take the interferometric wide swath, which is the largest and most standard instrument mode. We take both the vertical and vertical horizontal polarizations, and then both ascending and descending passes. So this is the direction of the satellite as it's crossing the Earth. And so you can imagine as it's imaging the Earth in one direction, it's going to have different characteristics than it will when it's coming around the other side, right? And so it's going to see different parts of the landscape. We filter these to winter months. And so we decided to use winter months because there's more of a distinguishing characteristic between our aspen forests and conifers, because we don't have that really deep penetration of the L band or the P band. When the leaves fall off of that aspen tree, we actually get this sort of interesting feedback from that return. So we do a winter, November through April, and then we take the median composite. So again, we have a median winter SAR composite. As I mentioned with the orbit pass, we then combine the ascending and descending and take the mean of those two images. So this is what we're seeing on the right here. On the top, our C-band vertical polarization, and on the bottom, our C-band vertical horizontal polarization. And it's difficult to see some of the differences at this scale, but there are differences on the edges of the forest area, where the VH is actually a little more sensitive to those edges between stands, right? And one of the reasons why we added this radar is to help distinguish between these sort of grassland and wetland areas and our forest cover, right? Because in the summer, they can often look really similar and they're both really productive. So that's our image data, basically building out that stack. Now the all-important training data. So any image classification is really only as good as its training data. For this project, we wanted to be really certain that we had quality training data for aspen forest cover. So what we did is we created this aspen presence masks using two different data sets. The US Forest Service individual tree species parameter map, which is a pretty interesting database of individual tree species modeled using FIA data and Landsat imagery. which gives estimates of basal area and stem density. These products are useful, but they often don't identify small stands, et cetera, same as the NLCD and Landfire. And they were created in 2011 and haven't been updated. They provide a lot of useful opportunity for studying forest dynamics though. And then we also take the Landfire existing vegetation type, isolate the aspen classes within that, and then we find agreement between these two data sets. This creates this aspen mask. And within this aspen mask, we then sampled randomly 1,000 different points throughout the Southern Rocky Mountain ecoregion. At each of these points, we consider them to be a photo interpretation plot, right? So when we're working at these scales, it's difficult to be in the field to do to build out plots across this large area. And so what we're doing here is creating photo interpretation plots where we go to the location of these randomly selected points. We build a 2 by 2 kilometer square around that point, and then we identify aspen pixels within that plot. After we do this iteratively across the Southern Rockies, we then make sure to filter or sample that data to ensure a 500-meter distance between points. So these points that you see here would be filtered down so that they're not right next to each other, right? So accounting for that spatial autocorrelation. So that's our presence data. And in this model, we're creating a binary classification, right? So zeros and ones. Our ones are aspen forests and our zeros are these pseudo absence or background points. So what we did to create this was we took our aspen mask, expanded those pixels by 2 pixels, right? So to create a sort of buffer around where we think there may be aspen. And then we did a stratified sampling within Landfire classification to account for the variation in all the different land cover types outside of our aspen forests, right? So stratified by land cover class, which means if there's more conifer, then there's going to be more background points in the conifer forest. So using this training data, we're able to then start to look at our Sentinel-2 imagery and our time series, right? To start to pick apart what is happening throughout the season at these locations of aspen forests. So what we're looking at here is on the left, our monthly average spectral response across the Sentinel-2 MSI bands in micrometers. What we can see, and this gray line here is the red edge region. So this is just showing, kind of highlighting that region and how it changes throughout the season. So this is one of the reasons why we are looking at seasonal composites as a way to map the species rather than single images. Because we can see that there's a lot of change throughout the season in the spectral response of these aspen forests. On the right here, we can see this is a spectral time series for the Sentinel-2 MSI bands on the top. So this is just showing throughout the year how the spectral response across these different bands changes. And then at the bottom here is our spectral indices showing the same kind of thing across time, what that spectral response looks like. And so we can see a lot with our chlorophyll indices, a pretty standard pattern here, right? With this peak in the summer of chlorophyll content, right? And so we can see that there's, these really distinguishable characteristics of aspen forests. So moving on to the classification methods. Again, we're still in Earth Engine, right? Google Earth Engine. So keep that in mind as well. So we take our training data, our presence and our absence. We sample those composite images, both from Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1. We perform some model selection. This is actually done outside of Earth Engine because we have a little bit more opportunity to look at some of the multicollinearity and feature importance in terms of this model selection. So I don't expect you to be able to read these plots because honestly, if it was big, you still wouldn't be able to read it. There's 72 different bands that we're testing. And so essentially all that's showing is that we tested multicollinearity, we removed highly multicollinear variables, and then we ran it through an iterative model selection process to identify which bands we wanted to keep in our model, right? So that's bands from our seasonal composites and our Sentinel-1 SAR. So through that variable selection, we were able to identify this sort of list of bands on the right side. And again, you don't need to be able to read that. If you're interested in learning more about any of these bands individually, feel free to reach out to me. We then train a random forest classifier using 60% of our training data to train the model, and then 40% holding out for validation. Okay, so that means basically we take 40% of our presence and absence data, we leave it aside to be able to test how well our model's doing. We then classify the image stack, getting our binary forest map, and we can measure our out-of-bag error estimate. And just really quickly, for those who don't know random forests, this plot is basically just showing where we start at a decision, and it just keeps making decisions in what we call trees. These trees are iterated over and over and over, and then a final decision is made by combining these different trees, right? So it's an ensemble modeling approach. So at least out of bag error, right? So basically the model performance using the train and testing data is resulting in this really high classification accuracy, cross-validation accuracy of 97%, which means the model is doing really well with its training data. And then a kappa coefficient of 95%, which means that there's a lot of agreement between our training data and our validation data. This is just a snippet of the testing error matrix. So you can see that, what we're seeing here is that 3,500 correctly classified as Aspen in our train set, 819 incorrect, and then in our test set, 33 incorrect, 683 correct, right? So we're seeing pretty high accuracy levels, at least gut check from the model results out of bag error. And this map is showing that same region outside of Crested Butte, and you can see that it's really picking up on these Aspen stands. Not just the large Aspen stand here, but these smaller ones around, and those are some of the ones that we're really interested in being able to capture. So as a gut check, we can look at that compared to our national land cover database and our existing vegetation type from Landfire. And so we can see that there's a lot more nuance in what our classification is picking up on in terms of the size of these Aspen patches, where they are, and delineating them, along their edge. We can see a lot of overlap in these pixels here, picking up on some of the wetland areas, and just generally over-classifying these Aspen forests. So moving on to accuracy assessment, and shout out to Adam here because he's been helping me a lot with getting this accuracy assessment pulled together. And it's a critical piece of this model because one of the concerns with binary classifications is that it's difficult to trust some of those accuracy assessments that come straight out of the model, right? And so being able to do an independent validation is important to understand, like, how well is this actually performing? So we did an independent photo interpretation campaign, similar to how we built our training data, but really relying on this NAPE 1 meter resolution, high resolution imagery. And so that's shown down here at the bottom, and the comparison between a NAPE image and a Sentinel-2 MSI image. So you can see that we have a lot more opportunity to identify these Aspen stands using high resolution imagery. And through an iterative process of learning what an Aspen looks like, we're able to, what we did is we buffered our training data, right? So the data that we had originally by 3 kilometers. This is to ensure that we're not putting out our validation points, our independent validation points near our training data, because we would expect that the model is performing better near the training data. We randomly sample Aspen pixels out of our classification. These random points are at least 5 kilometers apart, again, to account for that autocorrelation. This NAPE mosaic is a 2019 image mosaic for the whole Southern Rockies. And then we visit each site and determine whether an Aspen exists there or not. And so at each of these points, we create a 10-meter buffer just to sort of capture an area similar to a Sentinel pixel. And then if there's an Aspen present within that 10-meter buffer, then we would consider it to be a 1, not a 0. So this is kind of illustrating what we saw in that example image. NLCD and Landfire seem to be overmapping aspen forest cover, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. But this is what we're seeing in the data. So across the Southern Rockies, this figure at the top is showing area in hectares of aspen forests. And I've divided the Southern Rockies kind of semi-arbitrarily. That center line is the continental divide, right? And then 3 latitudinal gradients, right? And so that was just an attempt to sort of split this region into a couple different areas that may have similar characteristics as we work through this accuracy assessment and model validation. So based on our independent photo interpretation, we have this table here, which is just showing just basic accuracy assessment, how many correctly classified. What we're seeing with our image classification is an 85% classification accuracy, which is great. You know, it's not the 95 that we saw in the model, but that is to be expected, right? So 85%, and we can compare that using the same photo interpretation data set to Landfire at 63%, which actually matches what the Landfire report says for that region, and NLCD at a slightly higher 69%. And again, it's important to remember that NLCD doesn't explicitly call out aspen forests. So that's also probably another reason why we see such a larger difference in the NLCD. So this is an area that we're playing with and working on a little bit more, but there's been some papers coming out about the use of volunteer geographic data to look at species distributions. So we actually just pulled the iNaturalist research grade observations. So this is a citizen science observation data set. We pulled out all of the Populus tremuloides or quaking aspen cover out of iNaturalist. This actually resulted in over 1,000 points across the Southern Rockies where people have been taking photos of aspen and marking their locations. And you know, we know that these photos are often taken not right under a tree, right? So we wanted to just test and see how far away generally are these photo points from the nearest aspen pixel in our map. And what this histogram on the right is showing is just that. And about, you know, over 80% of the photo points in iNaturalist are within 10 meters of an aspen pixel. So that's, you know, pretty good. It's not a necessarily a end all be all accuracy assessment, but it's kind of interesting to see that, you know, hey, in general, these photo points are actually, you know, picking up near aspen. So just some next steps really quickly here. Continuing to do some accuracy assessment, which is ongoing. Adam and I are working on. So we have some partner field plots that are really actually meant for a bark beetle outbreak project, but they're across the Southern Rockies and they do have some aspen measurements. And so we're trying to leverage as much field data as we can from other projects to be able to incorporate that into this accuracy assessment. I actually ended up showing the volunteer data with iNaturalist. And then we also are interested in comparing estimated tree species parameters from FIA. So there's this really cool R library called RFIA. If you haven't heard of it and you work with FIA data, Forest Inventory and Analysis. So it's a US Forest Service monitoring program. You can estimate at various spatial scales, things like basal area, canopy cover area, et cetera. So doing some comparison in at least national forest lands with our maps. And then really working on some of this local and regional implementation. So this map that I showed today was developed across the entire Southern Rockies. And you know, as many of you know, there's a lot of different ecosystems across the Rockies and honestly, a lot of different aspen forest types. Aspen forests around Marble and Carbondale are different than aspen forests around Meadow. And so we're interested in also refining some of these models to just split it up into local regions and run these models independently and then combine them after. So that may help us to distinguish between similar classes that are more predominant in given areas. So in the southwest of Colorado, Gamble Oak is really, really predominant and is often confused with aspen. In fact, some of the most incorrect pixels for Landfire were called Gamble Oak. And so that's one area where maybe if we have local implementation, we're able to better distinguish between those similar types. And this is really the next steps. So this is, again, as I mentioned at the outset, funding from the Joint Fire Science Program. So this is a diagram from directly from our grant document that outlines our project aims. So we sit right here at aim 1, producing high resolution maps of aspen cover, and we're pretty near wrapping that up. And so the next step is really to move on to these really interesting questions about how do we quantify the effects of aspen presence on fire behavior. And so being able to use these high resolution aspen maps and how they're distributed across the landscape, configuration of stands in historic fires, we're going to attempt to recreate how the presence of aspen may have influenced fire behavior. We're also interested in quantifying influences on effectiveness of wildfire suppression operations. So did things like were fire lines more successful in areas that were abundant with aspen? And our partners at Colorado State University are really working through these 3 aims down here. And so this is sort of the next piece of the puzzle, which is like, okay, how do aspen moderate fire behavior, or do they? And then where might it be feasible to do management in this regard? Where could we actually go out on the landscape and do these management activities to promote aspen and expand aspen where they currently are? And that's all I have. I have some references here as well. I'll take questions.
We have one comment from online from Teresa. She says you could do the same with cottonwood or other species that get easily confused with aspen and do an opposite sort of analysis. Great idea using iNaturalist.
Yeah, and that's one of the sort of interesting things about this project is that these methods, the seasonal composite imagery, and these chlorophyll indices could be applied to other species, right? And in some way, what Teresa's saying, you know, and Jennifer has actually said this before too, is that we're not necessarily creating an aspen map. We are, but it's more of like a yellow tree map, right? It's identifying these deciduous species and tall deciduous species, right? We're okay with a little bit of willow and cottonwood being in there because they may have the same effect on fire behavior. So yeah, interesting point. Thanks, Teresa.
Can I ask another question? Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me. Max, I'm sorry I joined a little late because I just got your invite. I just have a question about the location of your accuracy points in relationship to like the center of a land fire or an NLCD pixel. Like are you smack in the center, or are you just somewhere in a 30-meter pixel?
Yeah, great question. It's actually in the center of a Sentinel pixel. We randomly sampled from our classified image. So those accuracy points are in the center of a Sentinel-2 pixel. And there's probably some ways that we could go about using maybe a buffered area or aligning it in a grid with landfire and NLCD 30-meter pixels. But as of right now, it's just and we're still working through that, but they're in the center of a Sentinel-2 pixel.
I think you're going to have to put it in the center of the NLCD and the landfire pixel for it to actually be a fair comparison. We can talk, but because you're kind of doing a mixed pixel, and I think if you had, if you were almost using the center points of the landfire and the NLCD pixels, like go in reverse direction and then align that with your Sentinel ones, it might be a more fair analysis. I don't know though, but you should think about that.
Yeah, it's a great point. And we might be able to still account for that without having to redo our photo interpretation, in terms of like, we could take the center pixel that we chose and create a window, a 9x9 window of Sentinel pixels that align with an LCD or landfire. And then look at the values within that pixel. Thanks, Teresa. That's a great point.
Yeah, I just don't think it's quite apples to apples yet. And I think you're going to want, I mean, it's a really good result, and you just want to make sure that it's a fair comparison.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that, Teresa. Ty?
So Aspen clump, but it doesn't feel like you've taken advantage of that fact in your models. So you're saying you're like taking out spatial autocorrelation, you're meaning everything out, sort of like assuming that the underlying distribution of trees is like randomly distributed across space when it's not.
Yeah.
And so it just feels like you could use these same tools in sort of a backwards way. Instead of washing out the spatial autocorrelation, you instead look for strong neighbor relations. And actually look for drawing out polygons, just knowing that Aspen are going to grow that way. You're never going to get like a random distribution of Aspen across the landscape. But just a biological fact that it feels like you could maybe take better advantage of to help you figure out how these things are.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something that we could actually still do, right? Because a lot of the training data we have and a lot of the photo interpretation are really clumped in nature because of those 2 by 2 kilometer plots, and really trying to capture most of the Aspen area within those plots. So it's probably something that we can actually still work through and maybe compare a map to without sort of removing all this data. And to your point too, it seems like feature extraction, something like object oriented.
Yeah, I think it would just take you away from recognizing a yellow tree to recognizing a stand of a clump of yellow tree, but something that maybe is more Aspen-like. My other question was about your median reduction.
Yeah.
So by clumping it by season and then picking the median, you're losing a lot of data there. And so I have sort of 2 questions about that is, did you look at those distributions and confirm to yourself that they were somewhat representative? You know, it's not like an exponential distribution where the median is not useful at all. So was there some confirmation there, and where that might play out in the future when you start comparing with fires is, do your seasons match up with fire season? So if you have like shoulder seasons and you're taking the median, and then you have a fire season that's squeezed in between them, you might, just by artifact of your map, find that they're not correlated very well. Sure. But it's just because you're sort of isolating each one at a time. So I guess I'm just saying, think maybe a little bit about that median reduction.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why use the median reduction is it did a better job with the cloud masking and compositing in terms of creating these images that were consistent across space without leaving a bunch of artifacts from either clouds or cloud shadows. That's one reason. The other is the times that we chose, right? So the times that we chose were relatively homogeneous in terms of their spectral response. So we chose, the midsummer where, the leaves are at their fullest before they fall off. And it's a, relatively short time period, right? And then in the fall too, that's where it may be, there may be a little more variation in that spectral response as different patches of Aspen are losing their leaves compared to others, and it changes it by elevation. So I'd be interested to talk with you more about how to maybe account for that.
Yeah. From
the fire perspective, I think we have an opportunity. We're not necessarily relying on the spectral data we use to classify Aspen forests, right? We can use spectral data from the fire season and during the fire to look at these relationships in relation to where Aspen is present on the landscape, right? So it's not necessarily using that spectral information to connect fire and Aspen. More so, we're using the Aspen presence and maybe configuration of Aspen, patch size, distribution, et cetera, and things like fire rated power, fire severity, stuff like that. So we might be able to bypass some of those issues because it's sort of a step ahead of where we use that spectral data. Thanks for that. Yeah.
I have actually 2 questions as well. My first question is regarding the mean composite of the Sentinel-1 data. So I'd like to understand why mean and not median in this case, and I didn't understand very well. So you have like a VV composite and a VH composite separately.
Yes.
Yes, okay. And why the mean?
So, well, that was really following literature. I had seen examples of VV and VH being treated as separate features in image classification because they have certain characteristics, especially when you're talking about forest canopy. So that was really the main reason for choosing to keep those separate. And then one of the things, so taking all of the Sentinel-1 images, we did do a median reduction for the winter image. We took the mean of the ascending and the descending. So we had a descending median composite and an ascending median composite. And then we just took the mean between those two.
Okay.
Yeah, to combine those. And so it gives us both
Got
look,
it.
it gives us both look angles. So most of the data, the actual composite creation was done through a median reduction as well.
Great. Yeah, but I agree with Ty that probably some analysis of data distribution would help at least to see. Well.
Yeah.
But my second question, I guess, has more implication on the analysis is about the accuracy assessment. I saw that your training data is not very well balanced between classes. So yeah, this sometimes is a problem for machine learning. And I'd like to understand if you have at some point account for this unbalancing. And if not, there are some metrics like accuracy assessment metrics that they are for unbalanced models. So, and they can get a more realistic accuracy assessment. And I guess in your case, you could access actually as well the class specific accuracy assessment, I guess. Be great, more detailed thing. And actually for unbalanced training as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I would love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, sure.
And what I tried to do with the sort of presence absence to try to keep it balanced was to use the same number of background points as we had presence points. However, the sort of distribution between those two is different, right? Because we're using these photo interpretation plots, so more confined space, and then the background points are distributed, stratified across other land cover types, all across, outside of our Aspen mask. So they're not clumped in space like the Aspen points are. So yeah, that'd be one to maybe, I'd love to touch base with you and see how we might be able to account for that a little bit better. And then one of the other things too is we're treating background points as just zeros. So we're not looking at other classes. So it's just, here is a stratified sample of background data. It's all not Aspen, right? Yeah, thank you. I'll follow up with you. Yeah.
Question about like the overall goals, kind of. Maybe just a clarifying question. And I know it's not really fair because you kind of said the CSU people were working on the part I was wondering about. But when it said that the goal was to identify sustainable areas for conversion of conifer forest to aspen, is the idea that like that would help with fire mitigation and like identifying areas where you can actually like seed aspen and that would help reduce the fire impact on the area?
Yeah, that's the general idea, right? And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence backing up these claims and some quantitative data as well. Not necessarily in this region, but there's the goal is wildfire mitigation for communities, particularly in high elevation. And some of the pilot studies that are already being done, so we have partners that supported us on the Joint Fire Science Program grant who are interested and or doing aspen conversion already. So one example would be the town of Breckenridge. They were a supporting partner on this project, and they're actually out planting aspen in clear cuts. And so the idea is like, hey, these clear cuts, we have to revisit them every so often. They tend to come back, you know, dog hair, lodgepole pine. They are unsightly and may change local sort of weather conditions too. And so it's not clear how much they do to actually affect fire behavior. So the idea is really to sort of take these clear cuts, at least up here in Breckenridge, and promote aspen in there to sort of kind of create a more like resistant and resilient forest type that may also have this fire benefit. But, you know, these partners are doing this work right now without a whole lot of research backing up, you know, what that dynamic actually looks like. And so that's really where this is. And so the whole body of knowledge body of knowledge that we're trying to build in this project is really to support that type of work that people are already interested in doing. Another project is like Rocky Mountain National Park. They're really interested in creating A, aspen expansion in general, but B, aspen buffers around the park as a way of preventing fire from escaping the park into Estes Park, for instance, or Granby. And so there's these managers who are kind of already interested in this work. And in some ways, we're almost playing catch up to that in terms of providing some science for them to be able to leverage to do those management activities. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
that's exactly what I was wondering. Thank you.
Question, Max. I can ask you later too, but so are you gonna generate a optimum leaf peeping map with roads and trails on it?
Yeah, I mean, kind of already doing that. Adam and I have gone out a few times this summer and used the map to identify areas where we want to go check out aspen stands.
Can you invite me?
And yeah, so there's actually a handful of places right outside, right up Boulder Canyon or up Chautauqua, where there's these like really nice big homogeneous aspen stands.
Just a couple quick comments too.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of using the clonal clumping nature of aspen, leveraging that, and it seems like a follow-up to with Sibelian type would be great. And then the other thing too that Ty got me thinking about was going back to the question of like, well, why would aspen actually change fire behavior? Like, what is it about aspen? It may be that using the SAR data, which gives structural information, may be a better indicator of shifts in or correlated shifts in fire behavior than say the presence absence map, because of, is it the color of the leaves that's changing fire behavior? Or is that color indicative of something else that we're measuring? I just, before we go down that road of AIM2, like I want to think pretty clearly about what structural, or it may even be biophysical too, like we may be losing some sort of flammability as those trees change, the leaves as they change and the trees are reabsorbing chemical content. So let's just dig into that a little bit more before we go down that road of like testing that question.
Yeah, I'm not diving into that quite yet, so that's
But
perfect.
it's coming sooner than.
It is. That's a really interesting point though, and I think that there's a lot of sort of interesting opportunity with Sentinel-1 to look at forest dynamics, and particularly in this question. So yeah, interested in continuing that conversation, and we'll follow up. Awesome.
Great job,
Thanks,
Max.
everyone.